This is Aubrey Sampson and Brian Fromm, hosts of The Common Good on AM 1160, and we're excited about this year's Lift 2021 virtual presentations on the topic of mental health and wellness for pastors and church leaders, presented by Hopeful Beginnings.
Each week in the month of July, we're releasing a new virtual presentation centered around an aspect of this topic. You can see all of them at 1160hope.com/lift.
And we're thankful to the supporting sponsors who made this series possible: Lydia Home, MyPillow, and Moody Theological Seminary.
This week, we're excited to hear from Hannah Gronowski Barnett, author, speaker, and CEO of Generation Distinct, an organization that empowers young adults to discover the wrong they were born to make right, leading them to experience who Jesus really is and compelling them to lead others to experience who Jesus really is.
We're glad that we can share this message with you from Hannah Gronowski Barnett as part of Lift 2021.
Because of my role as the CEO of a nonprofit organization called Generation Distinct that works with next generation leaders, as well as being a 26-year-old leader myself, I often have pastors or leaders, CEOs come up to me and say, "Hannah, how do I engage the next generation into my church or ministry or organization?" And I think this is a really important question. In fact, I believe it is essential for us to be asking this question right now at this point of history, especially as we come out of a COVID-19 reality. But it's very important for us to identify the why behind the question. You see, it's not enough to ask that question just so that our churches and ministries and organizations become younger. It's not enough to ask that question just to try and make our churches and ministries and organizations trendier or cooler or more relevant. None of those reasons are a good enough reason for us to put time and energy into learning how to engage the next generation into our churches. However, there is a very important reason, and it's this. There is a generation rising up who desperately need to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that is the only reason that would make sense for us to spend time and energy and resources in order to crack the code and discover how to engage the next generation into our churches and ministries and organizations. You see, Gen Z is rising up, and it's an important moment for us to have this conversation because many of Gen Z actually now have been hurt by the American church. And more often than not, they see very little value in what the American church currently has to offer them. And this really matters because Gen Z is growing up. In fact, they're no longer just the kids filling up your kids' ministries. They're no longer even just the middle schoolers and high schoolers attending your weekend camp. They're not even just the kids graduating and going into college. They're starting to graduate college and enter into the business world. They're getting influence on social media. They're going and they're casting a vote for the kind of world they want to live in. They're marching down the streets of Washington. They are leading in our world. And there's another generation, Gen Alpha, who are looking to them for what they should want. Gen Z are now the leaders in our world. And they're the very same people who are hurt by the church, therefore leading the next generation to also be skeptical of what we have come to believe is the beautiful, holy, good church. So here we stand in this tension, in this paradox between a generation who is hurt by the church and skeptical of what it has to offer, while also knowing they're leading and influencing. And what do we do with that? It's interesting because we're not the only ones asking this question. In fact, Relevant Magazine recently came out with a very interesting article recording some of the statistics that Barna Research has done specifically about this topic, and I want to read part of it to you right now. Here is what Relevant Magazine tells us. 34% of Gen Z identify as atheist, agnostic, or non-religious. They go on to say the data from the Barna Group is clear. Young people are drawing back from, if not running from the church as their predecessors know it. But maybe that's a good thing. They go on to say that 9 out of 10 members of Gen Z say that the American church is too judgmental. And 85% described it as hypocritical. 1/3 of people said the American church, get this, is characterized by moral failures in leadership. And a startling 70% found the church insensitive to others. They said the question here isn't how can we draw the next generation back into the church? The question is, can we blame them for not showing up? You see, we stand in the midst of a generation hungry for more than what the American church is currently offering them. And so it's time for us as leaders to discover how do we adequately engage a generation back into our church who has no interest and actually sees it as a hypocritical, judgmental place where people are failing out because of moral issues. What do we do with that? Can we blame them for not showing up? And when I ask these big questions that can seem overwhelming, I always believe that there's a way that we can learn from the greatest leader of all time. You see, when Jesus was on this earth, walking around and on a mission to build the very first church, he had a strategy that he used to engage the next generation of his day to join him in his mission. And I believe we would do well to learn from the example of Jesus. And so we're going to go ahead and do that today together. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 4, verse 18. Here's what it says. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once, they left their nets and followed him. Okay, so here we have Jesus, right? And he's here on this earth and his public ministry is just beginning. And a lot of us know this story, but the part of the story that I believe is so important for us to identify today together is that when Jesus was building his first team to go out with his mission and build the church, he didn't go to the palace. He didn't go to the religious leaders. No, he went to the shore. And he looked out and he saw 2 brothers. And most of us would agree and know that many theologians believe that at the time when this story takes place, Andrew was probably in his late teens and Peter was most likely in his early 20s. So here we have a story about how Jesus approached the next generation of his day. And so what if there's a strategy that Jesus used to engage the next generation of his day that we also can adopt to reach the next generation of our day? I believe there is. I believe we can identify 2 important, essential pieces in the invitation of Jesus that we too can emulate as we invite the next generation into our church and ministry. And it's number 1, we see that Jesus invited Peter and Andrew to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world. And number 2, he invited them to find a family to fight alongside. And Jesus didn't say, hey, just come to my church. He didn't say, hey, just attend this service or go to this club. No, he had two essential pieces. He invited them to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world and find a family to fight alongside. Let's focus on number one here for just a minute. You see, so many times in our churches and ministries and organizations, we cater our programs to the next generation, hoping that somehow it'll attract them in. We plan these elaborate parties and bonfires and movie nights. We throw big events with flashing lights and fancy features, hoping beyond hope that the next generation will hear about it and want to show up. But here's the reality, that exists in the world already. There are concerts and hangouts and parties that the next generation can find at their universities or in their community. You know what they can't find? An opportunity to make wrong things right in the world. Really. Yes, there's places for them to march. Yes, there's places for them to talk about changing the world, but so many of the next generation are craving an opportunity to actually create lasting change in the world. And the exciting part is that you and I know the only way to create lasting change is through the person of Jesus. We have the secret, and Jesus knew that. When he said, hey, come follow me, he didn't invite Peter and Andrew into an easy life, into a fun event, into a worship night. He invited them in, and then he trained them to go out and bring healing to the oppressed, to see those who are forgotten, to cross over lines that nobody else was crossing over. He gathered them in, and then he sent them out to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world. The question is, are you doing that for the next generation in your community? Are you trying to get the next gen in your community just in your church? Or are you training them? Are you using your church as a training ground to unleash world changers into your community? That is the question. Are you helping them to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world? And this doesn't have to be complicated. Invite them in and talk about things that are happening in the world. Educate them on ways that they can go about and bring change. Mobilize them into the community to serve, to love their neighbors. That is some practical ways. You don't have to bring them in. Send them out to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world, and you're going to see the next generation start to be interested in your church. Number two, Jesus invited them to find a family to fight alongside. You see, Jesus could have invited just one or two people, but he created this team of 12 people that he would invest in and train and develop and allow them to follow him in his ministry. But then he sent them out in pairs of two. He sent them out, and when they came back, yes, they were tired and beaten down and abused, but they were in it together, and so they could empathize, they could strengthen each other. And the reality is your next gen, your community, they don't just want more friends. They don't just want more people to follow them on social media. They are craving the kinds of friends who will be with them in the fight, who will say, I want to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world too, so let's link arms and do it together. What if your church was a place where world changers flocked because they knew, the next generation knew they could go in there and be trained to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world, but they weren't going to do it together. They were going to do it with a family to fight alongside. It's not just about starting small groups where they go in and they talk about Jesus. It's about training them to be on mission together. It's what we see Jesus do in the lives of the next generation of his day. And I believe it is what we can do as well to unleash the next generation in our church and have them reinterested in what the local church is actually all about. So how are you equipping the next generation in your city to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world and to find a family to fight alongside? Relevant Magazine went on with a really interesting conclusion, and I want to read it to you right now. Here is what they said. Speculate for a moment what might happen if the religious members of Gen Z grow up and stay in the church. A projection of all this data points to churches that are more diverse, more transparent, compassionate, and active in the surrounding community. The best case scenario is the Gen Z church looks like an active response, a push back, really, to the critiques the church faces right now. Here's the question. What if Gen Z isn't the greatest threat to the American church? What if, in fact, they are the greatest opportunity to make a return back to what the church has always been about? Passion, sacrifice, risk, excitement, mission, vision. It's what Acts 2 describes as the very first local church that was built by the next generation of that day. And what if Gen Z is about to lead us back into that kind of church? A church that shows up for people, a church that crosses over lines, a church that comes together with a family to fight alongside in order to rebuild the ruptured parts of our world. The next generation in your community, they're ready to be sent out. The only question is the American church ready for them?